We continue now at the top of Daf Lamed Tesam and Beis in Meseches Gitin. This is Gittin Daf 39b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara brought a brisa which had a machlokas between the Tanakam and Abba Shaul in a situation where a ger dies, a convert dies, he leaves over no yorshim, there are no people to inherit his property, so the Jews are plundering his property, and among the property is slaves. And the Tanakama says that the slaves go free in that situation, they acquire themselves. However, Abba Shaul makes a distinction between slaves that are adults and slaves that are minors. He says that slaves that are adults, they're able to acquire themselves, but slaves that are minors, they cannot acquire themselves, and so anyone who acquires them acquires those avodim. And the Gemara brought that Rabbi Yaakov Baridi said in the name of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi that the halach is like Abba Shaul. We do make a distinction between adult slaves and slaves that are minors, and the slaves that are minors do not acquire themselves. And so Rabbi Zera said to Rabbi Yaakov Baridi, Beferish shmialach or michlala shmialach. Did you hear this beferish, meaning to say, did you hear Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi say explicitly that the halach is like Abba Shaul, or did you just draw an implication, did you just infer from something that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said that the halach is like Abba Shaul? And the Gemara said, my klala, what would be the inference? What would Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi have said, which would indicate that he held like Abba Shaul? The Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, because Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, Amru lifnei Rebbe, they said before Rebbe, Amar nisiya ashti miploni avdi ma'u. If somebody says, I've given up hope of ever recovering my Eved, what is the halacha? Amar lahem, so he said to them, Rebbe responded to them, Omer ani, I say, ein lo takana el b'shtar, that there is no solution in this case unless you have a shtar, unless you have a document. Rashi says, Beferish shmialach, again Rabbi Zera said to Rabbi Yaakov Baridi, did you hear this explicitly made Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi from Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, or was it inferred? And the Gemara said, my klala, what would it have been inferred from? Me'eza klal yeshli lilmod de kavais minoi mechlala shmialach. From where did I hear something that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said that I was thinking maybe you inferred it from that? Nisya ashti lashon hefkerhu. Again, Nisya ashti, if it says I gave up hope from my Eved, that's the case over here that they were talking about with Rebbe. So that's the same thing as making the Eved hefker. And so he said in that situation, Ein lo takana bebas Yisrael velo b'shivcha. What it means there's no solution for the Eved is that an Eved, if an Eved is actually an Eved, so then the solution, so to speak, is that the Eved can marry a shivcha. And if someone is free, he can marry Bas Yisrael. But here we have a situation where the Eved was essentially made hefker, so he has no solution. He can't marry a Bas Yisrael, and he can't marry a shivcha. Sharei meshukher hu ktsas, because he's somewhat free. Ve'eno gamra, but he's not totally free. That's what he was saying when he said, Ein lo takana el b'shtar. There is no solution over here unless he is freed with a document. In this situation where he was just freed as being hefker, he's not totally free and he has no solution. V'yomer Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan said, my time of the Rebbe. What's the reason of Rebbe? Gomar lo me'isha. He learns out lo from an isha. He learns out a gzera shava from a wife. Ma'isha b'shtar, just like by a wife, the wife is divorced with a document. Af eved nami b'shtar, so too when it comes to an eved, the eved needs a document. Rashi says, Ma'isha im hifkira bala. The point is over here as follows. If a husband would make his wife hefker, so to speak, lo hitira linase, she wouldn't be allowed to remarry la'acher to another person bekach, as Gitin beget, unless she actually has a document. It has to be with a document. There's no concept of hefker to allow a wife to remarry. And so the same thing is true by an eved. You can't say that an eved is going to remarry just through hefker. There has to be a document. And now you inferred from here, because this entire discussion really begins with a statement from Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi quoting this discussion with Rebbe. So now you infer as follows. If this whole thing has to do with a comparison to a wife, so then we can infer further to compare the Eved to the wife as follows. Ma'isha isura v'lo memona. Just like by a wife, what you're talking about by a wife is there's no ownership of a wife. A husband doesn't own his wife in a monetary sense. It is only an ownership, so to speak, in the sense of isur v'heter. The wife is not allowed to marry someone else. The wife is acquired by the husband that she can't marry anyone else. So af eved nami isura v'lo memona. So too, when we're talking about eved over here, when we're talking about this discussion with an eved, we're talking about isur and not mammon. And Rashi explains because so we can infer from this discussion as follows. Kevon de Rebbe me'isha yolef. If it's true that Rebbe is learning it from a wife, as Rabbi Yochanan is saying, Gamar lo la me'isha, so lo ayri Iri Rebbe ela b'mafkir eved gadol. It must be that what Rebbe was talking about when he talks about making your eved hefker, and he says ein lo takana, we're talking about a person who's mafkir his eved that's an adult. Sheyesh lo yad liknos atzmo. That eved has the ability to acquire himself. Umishefkeiro ein lo olav ela iser. And so therefore, at the moment that he's made ownerless, the only thing that exists is this iser, meaning in terms of the fact that the eved is not allowed to marry a bas Yisrael. Avalo mammon, but there is no monetary ownership over that eved. Ki isha zu, just like a wife, sheget shalah, eino bal hafkia, mammon sheyesh lo ela iser. By a wife, when you give a get to a wife, the purpose of the get has nothing to do with monetary, it has to do with iser. Avol be'eved katan, but let's say you'd be talking about a slave that's a minor, lo iri Rebbe. So Rebbe wasn't dealing with that case. When Rebbe said that in a situation of an eved that's hefker, there's no takana, he was talking specifically about an adult eved, because by an adult eved, when you make that eved hefker, so there is no monetary rights over that eved. The eved is an adult, he has the ability to acquire himself. All you have with that eved is a situation of iser, and that's the case where there's no takana. But by an eved katan, the lav dumya de ishahu, that's not similar to a wife. The iko drora de mamona aleh, because by an eved that's a katan, there is monetary ownership over that katan. The katan doesn't have any ability to acquire. Uvididei svir aleh de yesh lo takana b'shifcha. The point is that Rebbe would say that in that situation, if you declare the eved katan ownerless, that eved could still marry a shifcha. That wouldn't be a problem to lo kana atzma behefker, because an eved katan doesn't have the ability to acquire himself from hefker, from the fact that he's ownerless, and so therefore in that situation there would be a takana. Rebbe was only dealing with an eved that is a gadol. And we should note over here that the Mefarshim do point out a slight difficulty with Rashi's explanation of the Gemara, because Rashi's explanation of the Gemara is assuming this distinction between an eved that's an adult and an eved that's a minor. That distinction was made by Abba Shaul himself, meaning the idea that the eved gadol acquires himself and goes free when he's made hefker, and there's no monetary ownership over that eved, and that applies by a gadol, but it doesn't apply by a katan. That specifically was the shita of Abba Shaul. Again, the Tanakama of the Brisa, the Tanakama that argued with Abba Shaul, actually said that the avodim all go free, whether you're talking about an eved that's a gadol or an eved that's a katan. So it is a little difficult. How is it that this statement of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, this discussion of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, in terms of what happened with Rebbe, how does that prove that he holds anything like Abba Shaul? The entire assumption here that it's following Abba Shaul assumes like Abba Shaul in the first place. Essentially, it is somewhat of a circular argument. And in any case, the Gemara continues, Vi mechlol lamai. Now, if it is learned from an implication, why is that implication possibly not correct? Rashi says, Vi mechlol yalfin. If you're learning it from an implication from something, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, Mai kashalach begava. What's the difficulty? As if you're asking, did I hear it explicitly or was it implied? What is wrong with this implication? And the Gemara says to that, the implication is not certain. Amar Lei said to Madrab, on the contrary, if you want to infer something, you could actually infer in the opposite direction if you want. Ma'isha ben gedola ben katana. If we're learning from a wife, just like by a wife, there's no distinction between if she's an adult or a minor. Af eved nami ben gadol ben katan. Maybe on the contrary, maybe by an eved also there is no distinction by an adult or a minor. So maybe it implies the exact opposite. Maybe we can infer the exact opposite, not like Abba Shaul. And Rashi explains, Dok mina lahai gisa ma'isha ben gedola ben katana hatarasa beget. The point is that the get you're giving to a wife, that is just as effective if she's an adult or a minor. There's no distinction. So you can go the other direction. Af mafkir avdo, the Iri Bei Rebbe, so too, the case that Rebbe's talking about where a person is mafkir is eved, bein gadol ben katan kamar. Maybe we're talking about being mafkir and eved, whether it's an adult, whether it's a minor. V'dumyo di isha hula'ach gisa, go in that direction in terms of comparing it to a wife. And then if we're talking about a minor, or we're talking about an adult, meaning to say in all situations, it could be that there is no monetary claim over the eved, and essentially the eved goes free, not like Abba Shaul, who made the distinction between an eved that's an adult and an eved that is a minor. And the Gemara continues, Amar Le, he said to him, Rav Yaakov Baridi responded, Befeirish Shmi Aliyah, I heard explicitly from Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi that the halacha is like Abba Shaul. It was not something that I drew from an inference. And the Gemara continues, Rav Chia bar Abba, Amar Rav Yochanan, and Rav Chia bar Abba says that Rav Yochanan says, Ein halacha like Abba Shaul, the halacha is not like Abba Shaul, meaning we do not make a distinction between avodim that are adults and avodim that are minors. Amar le Rabbi Zeir, Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Rabbi Zeir said to Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Befeirish Shmi Alacha, Mechlala Shmi Alacha, again along the same lines as before. Did you hear this Befeirish from Rabbi Yochanan, or was it something that you drew from an inference? And the Gemara says, My klala, in what way would you infer it? The Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, because Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, and again this is the same as above, Amru lifnei Rebbe, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said that they said before Rebbe, Nesia ashti miploni avdi ma'u. If a person says, I've given up hope from my particular Eved, what's the halacha? Again, that's a situation of hefker. Amar lehem, he said to them, Omer ani, I say, ein lo takona el b'shtar. There is no solution unless you have a document. Such an Eved is not able to marry a Bas Yisrael, and also not able to marry a Shifcha. V'yomer Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan said on that, my time with the Rebbe, what's the reason of Rebbe? Gamar lo la me'isha, he learns out of Gzer Shava, the word law, from Isha, from a wife. Ma'isha b'shtar, just like a wife is divorced with a document. Af Eved nami b'shtar, so to the Eved requires a shtar, requires a document. V'kadayacht mina, so maybe you inferred from that, ki Isha, that it's like a wife. Ma'isha ben gedola ben ketana, just like by a wife, the document, the get works, whether she's an adult or whether she's a minor. Af Eved nami, so to by Eved also, ben gadol ben katan, there's no distinction whether the Eved is an adult or a minor. And the Gemara says, but if it's an inference, so what's the problem with the inference? And the Gemara says the other direction, adrab, on the contrary, dokamina lahachi, so you can go the other direction. Ma'isha isura v'lo mamona, just like by a wife, we're talking about something that is a prohibition in terms of isur v'heter, but it's not a monetary issue. Af eved nami isura v'lo mamona, so too by an eved, we're talking about the type of eved where all that exists is the isur issue, and there is no monetary issue, meaning maybe we're only talking about an adult and not a minor, as we explained before. Amar Lein, he said back to him, Befeirush Shmili. I heard this explicitly from Rabbi Yochanan. It was not something that I drew from an inference. And the Gemara continues, Amar Mar, the master said, Amar Lehem, he said to them, Omer Ani, I say, again, this was Rebbe, Ein lo takana el b'shtar. There's no solution over here unless he receives a document that sets him free, meaning in this situation where you have an Eved, where the owner made him hefker, the case over there specifically was the owner had Yush, so in such a situation, he's not allowed to marry a Bas Yisrael, and he's not allowed to marry a Shifcha because he was set free at the monetary level, but without receiving a shtar, he's not set free in terms of Isser, and therefore, again, not allowed to be with a Shifcha, and not allowed to be with a Bas Yisrael. But the Gemara says, is this really the case that the only solution for the Eved is a shtar? But we learned in a Bryce. So Rebbe says, and this was earlier on the previous daf, Omer Ani, I say, Af hu nosin demei atzmo, v'yotzei mipnei shuhu kemochro lo. He's able to pay for himself and go free because it's like he's selling him to himself. The case over there was, again, you were talking about a person that was makdish the Eved, and the situation was that the Eved is able to buy himself from Hektish. That was the case over there, and apparently through Kesef he's able to go free. And so the Gemara says, Hachi Kamar, this is what it means to say, O bekesef, o b'shtar. There are two ways actually that the Eved can go free. He can either use kesef in a situation where he's purchasing himself, or he can use a document. However, what Rebbe was saying was v'hai pakale kaspe. But in this particular case, where the owner had yish, the owner made the Eved hefker, so there is no monetary ownership over the Eved, and so kesef does not apply in this situation. The only thing that is left is a shtar in this particular case. But again, in general, there are cases where kesef is an option. And the Gemara continues, ulafuke mehaitona detach. And this excludes the Tana of the following brisa, meaning to say Rebbe who says that kesef is effective, that is different than the Tana of the following brisa. Rabbi Shimon Omer Mishum Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shimon says in the name of Rabbi Akiva, Yachol Yehei kesef gomer ba kederech sheshtar gomer ba. I might think that kesef is effective the same way that shtar is effective. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says va'aftei lo nifdasa, that she was not redeemed. Ora kol parsha kula lolochu pasha. The entire parsha ends that she was not freed. Lomar lach, and that's to tell you shtar gomer ba ve'ein hakesef gomer ba, that the shtar is effective. This is talking about freeing a maidservant, and money is not effective. And again, this is different than Rebbe, who says that money is effective. We'll take a look at the full pasuk before we see Rashi. The pasuk says here, V'ishki yishka ves isha shechva zera. This is a man that's together with a woman, v'hishivcha necherefes liish, and she's a shivcha, and she's with another man. In other words, it's almost like a case of adultery, but it's not exactly like a case of adultery. It's not a case where the Jew is with a married woman. It's a case where the Jew is with a woman who is a shivcha, who is with, and that shivcha belongs to another man. V'hafdei niftaso chufsha lo nitan lan. It says she wasn't redeemed, she wasn't given her freedom, meaning to say she's still a shivcha. Bikores tia lo yumsu ki lo chupasha. And then the pasuk ends, they don't die. It's not treated like a regular case of adultery because she was not freed. And so Rashi over here explains, that which we learned, that an Eved can become mutter if he's redeemed or he buys himself with money, so that's different than the following Tana. Yachol Yehei Kesef Gomer, again, this is the Tana Rabbi Shimon in the name of Rabbi Akiva. I might think that Kesef is effective shechrura, meaning that Kesef can make her go free, af lahafkia midei iser, even to the extent, not just in the monetary sense, but in the sense that there's no iser. But that is not the case. Ora kol haparsha, kol mikra haparsha, ora v'simua lo chupasha. That entire parsha, it ends off saying that she wasn't freed, and since she wasn't freed, this is not a case of adultery. It doesn't say they don't die because she wasn't redeemed. She wasn't freed. It says the real reason that it's not a situation of adultery is because she wasn't freed. And so Rashi continues, Shema Mino, we see from this, Ki nifdasa nami, that even in a case, let's say, where she was redeemed, but she wasn't given a shtar, meaning, let's say she was redeemed with kesef, even in that situation, lo yum, so they don't die, it's not considered adultery. De'ein b'kiddushin misham eishes ish, this is not considered a real situation of eishes ish. Hoel v'lo nichtav lo get shichur, because she was never really freed. She was never given a document that freed her, and therefore this woman cannot have real kiddushin. V'achi kamar kran, here's what the pasuk is saying. V'afdei lo nifdasa, she wasn't redeemed. Peduya ve'ina, peduya meaning she's somewhat redeemed but not fully redeemed. Hanecherefes leish, and she's together with another man. Could go, and for example, the cases like this: shivcha kananis. Let's say you have a shivcha kananis. Chetzia shivcha v'chetzia baschor, and she's half a slave and she's been half freed. Hamu'urezes le'eved ivri, and she's betrothed to an eved ivri. Shumuter b'shivcha, an eved ivri is allowed to marry a shivcha. Ubebaschor, an eved ivri is also allowed to marry a baschor, a free woman. So in such a situation, you have this shivcha kananis who's with an eved ivri. The eved ivri is allowed to marry her because she's half shivcha. He's allowed to marry a shivcha. She's half free. He's allowed to marry a free woman. So in that situation, she's not considered like a regular married woman in terms of adultery. And if another man is with her, it's just an asham. It's a carbon asham. The lo nifdasa klal. Now, if she wasn't redeemed at all, let's say it was a situation where she's a full shivcha, so in kan asham, then there wouldn't even be an asham. Ulakach huzkura pediya. That's why some form of redemption is mentioned over here. There has to be some element of redemption in order that there be a carbon asham. But it doesn't mean to say that, let's say she was fully redeemed and now all of a sudden it's a total kiddushin and you have a case of adultery over here, and the person who's with her gets the death penalty. That we see from the end of the pasuk. Because from the fact that at the end of the pasuk it says they don't die because she wasn't freed, which is referring to a document, mashma ora din misasa bechipush hashtar. That implies that the idea of the death penalty only applies when she was freed with a document. Even if she was redeemed fully, but she wasn't given a shtar, meaning in terms of money she was redeemed fully, but she wasn't given a shtar, ein ba misa, there would be no death penalty. When it says she wasn't redeemed, it's a chiddush. Even though she wasn't fully redeemed, she was just partially redeemed. Ika asham, there is going to be a carbon asham in that situation. But in any case, what do you see over here? You see that her status as a shivcha, it remains. The fact that she's redeemed with money is not enough. The only thing that really removes that status in terms of iser v'heter is going to be a document, is going to be a shtar. And Rashi continues, gomer ba, what is this language of gomer ba, that the shtar seems to be effective? That means motzia legamri, that means it takes her out completely from avdus. Bein mi shibud, bein mi iser, meaning she's no longer in servitude in the monetary sense, and also in the sense of iser v'heter, she no longer has the status of a shivcha at all. Ve'ein kesef gomer ba, but that's not true by money. De'eino motzi elamidei shibud. Money can take her out in terms of servitude, in terms of the monetary aspect. Avalomidei iser shivcha, but she's still considered a shivcha in terms of iser v'heter. She kiddushin tovsin ba, and that's why the kiddushin are not effective if she's still considered a shivcha in that sense. And again, that is different than Rebbe. Rebbe says kesef is gomer ba. Kesef is effective not only in the monetary sense, but also in terms of iser v'heter. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rami Bar Chama, Amar Rav Nachman. Rami Bar Chama says that Rav Nachman says, Halacha Rabbi Shimon, the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon, meaning again, the halacha is that even though the shtar is effective, the kesef is not fully effective, it's not effective in terms of Isser v'heter. Rav Yosef Bar Chama, Amar Rav Yochanan, and Rav Yosef Bar Chama says that Rav Yochanan says, Ein halacha Rabbi Shimon, the halacha is not like Rabbi Shimon, and kesef is going to be effective. And the Gemara continues, Ashkechei Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak l'Rava Bar Sheilta. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak found Rava Bar Sheilta. Some have the gears of Rava Bar Shilas. To have a koya pischa devei tefillin. He was standing at the door of the Beis HaKnesses of the shul. Amar lei said to him, halacha ein halacha. Is the halacha like Rabbi Shimon or not? Amar lei said to him, ani omer ein halacha. I say that the halacha is not like Rabbi Shimon. However, v'rabbanan da'asu mi mechuza amri, but the rabbanan that came from mechuza, they say, Amar Rabbi Zeira mishmei Rav Nachman, that Rabbi Zeira said in the name of Rav Nachman, halacha, that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon. V'chi asoi l'sur, and when I came to Surah, ashkachtei l'Rav Chia bar Avin, I found Rabbi Chia bar Avin, Amri le emali izi gufa du'uvda hechi havin. I said to him, Tell me, my friend, what exactly was the situation? Amar li, he said to me, there was a maidservant whose master was a shchimera, meaning her master was on his deathbed. Asiya bachya kamei, and she came and she cried in front of him. Amrle, and she said to him, how long are you going to enslave me? Let me go free already. So how long are you going to enslave this particular woman? So Shakal kumsei shadaba, so he took his hat and he threw it to her. He was trying to do like a kinyan chalipin. Amar lo, he said to her, zil kniha o kni nafshich, acquire this and then you can acquire your soul. In other words, he tried to free her with this kinyan chalipin, which is essentially a kind of a kinyan of kesef. So he was trying to use this kinyan of kesef to free her. So also l'kamei de Rav Nachman. So they came before Rav Nachman. Amar lo, he said to them, lo asav lo klum. What he did was nothing. She doesn't go free. And Man Dechaza, the one who saw this incident, Savar Mishum Da'alachak Rabbi Shimon, he thought that the reason he was passing this way was because the halach is like Rabbi Shimon, that Kesef is not effective. Veloi, but that's not really true. Really, Kesef is effective. El Mishum Dahavale Kalev Shel Makna. The real reason this wasn't effective was because this was the Kalim rather, the vessel of the Makna, meaning the owner, he was giving his hat. He was using his hat for the Kinyan Chalipin, and we hold the halach is that you have to use Kalev Shel Kona. You have to use the vessel of the person who's acquiring, not the makna. That's why it wasn't effective in this case. It really had nothing to do with the fact that the halach is like Rabbi Shimon. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Achisai, Amar Rav Hamnuna Saba. Rav Shmuel bar Achisai says that Rav Hamnuna Saba says, Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Ashian, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Hamnuna. That Rav Yitzchak bar Ashian says, that Rav Huna says, that Rav Hamnuna says, halacha ki Rabbi Shimon. The halacha is like Rabbi Shimon. Again, the kesef is not effective. Veloi, but it's not true. Ein halacha ki Rabbi Shimon. The halacha is not like Rabbi Shimon. Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Amar Ravashi, Amar Rebbe. Rabbi Zera said that Rabbi Chanina said that Ravashi said that Rebbe said Eved shenasa es paschor b'fnei Rabbo. If an Eved marries a free woman in front of his master, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Mem Amud Aleph.